It's my great pleasure to introduce you to Luke Fletcher, Professor Luke Fletcher from Manchester Metropolitan, who's going to talk to us today. Luke, I'm not going to steal your thunder. Would you just like to jump in and tell us
Yeah,
all about yourself and what you're going to talk to us about?
yeah. Let me just get the screen set up so that's one less problem to worry about. Can everyone see that okay? Yeah, great. So yeah, thank you, Claire, for inviting me today. It's really great to talk to everybody today. I always find sometimes doing these online events, you get a much wider group of people that are able to attend these things. So thank you for attending today. So yeah, so as Claire said, I'm a professor at Manchester Metropolitan University. I joined Manchester Met in January last year, so it's been about a year now. I can't believe it
Luke,
has.
sorry to
Yeah,
interrupt. Would you
yeah.
mind putting this on so it's big, so we're not seeing the slides at the side. So put it on
Oh,
the
it's gone
slideshow.
big for me. So hang on, let me just check. I'm used to MS Teams, so it's slightly different on Zoom.
Yeah, we like to thwart people by moving them between Teams and Zoom, don't we?
Yeah, let me unshare and then
If not, it doesn't matter. We can still see it.
let me just try that again. I think I'm just going to do the share screen rather than the presentation app thing. Is that better?
At the moment, it's a black screen. There we go. That's it. Perfect.
Okay, great. Okay, so always technological issues. Okay, so yeah, I joined Met last year, so it's been a year now. I was previously at University of Bath and previously before that at Aston in Birmingham. I live in Birmingham. And I'm a psychologist by background, so I'm primarily a researcher focusing on kind of the intersection between kind of people management practice, HR stuff, and applied psychology and kind of lived experience of work. And I used to kind of do a lot on things around employee motivation, employee engagement, and meaningful work, and I still do quite a lot of that work. But over about kind of the last 7 or 8 years, I've been really interested in ED&I issues, particularly around LGBT inclusion. So in the last few years, I've really been focusing on what it's like to be an LGBT person at work and how do LGBT people navigate careers and leadership experiences throughout kind of different organizations. So that's just a bit about me. I live in Birmingham with my civil partnership and our two little dogs, which you can see there. So I'm just going to launch straight into the agenda. There we go. Has it flipped through? Yeah. So, just as a quick agenda, we're going to cover a little bit about kind of why we need to focus on kind of ED&I from a kind of personal perspective as LGBT people, but in general, and then focusing more on kind of what does LGBT identity really mean in the workplace? What are some of the kind of issues around that and opportunities? Focusing more on kind of openness, what we might say coming out at work, but it's more nuanced about that. It's about kind of the everyday kind of decisions that you have to make about revealing certain information to other people about who you are. And then focusing on kind of on the lived experience of being authentic or authentically kind of experiencing yourself at work. And then we're going to go more into depth on authentic leadership and kind of what that brings about in terms of LGBT kind of opportunities, but also kind of tensions that might arise when we're trying to express ourselves authentically in a leadership role. And then because of all the kind of, we know that that's quite difficult, particularly in the at the moment with the social political situation going on. How do we then kind of maybe perhaps move forward responsibly in that area? So just focusing to begin with, just getting us back into kind of why we need to focus on this. From a personal perspective, I suppose, in your own kind of view of life, we need to understand the complexity of identity that everybody comes with lots of different uh, groups that they belong with, identities that they associate with. So it's more complicated than just am I LGBT or am I not LGBT or am I a man or a woman, for example. It's much more complicated and there's lots of intersections between things like gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, and that's both personal, as in your own experience, but also how you may relate to other people, their own experience. And I don't really like to call things, I mean, we talk about unconscious bias and biases, but I think it's sometimes better to reframe some of that around the idea of subjectivities, that we all come with our own uh, history of experiences, backgrounds, and that kind of shapes and colors what we see and what we perceive and how we interpret the world. So I don't necessarily like the term bias because it always seems to suggest there's something really negative about that. But we all come with a kind of set of lived experiences and history that we then use to interpret our worlds. So it's when we think about ED&I, we're all bringing our own kind of subjective view on that. We also need to be aware of the kind of everyday dynamics of ED&I work. We often think about the big picture stuff around policies, practices, but we also need to think about how does that translate into kind of the everyday little things like meetings, interactions with people, client facing work that we do, and so on. So what does that really look like? How does that kind of translate from those bigger policies down? And I think we're noticing at the moment that we need to really be much more sensitive to conflicting issues as they arise when we do this kind of work. As we know, there's particular kind of nubs of issues at the moment, particularly around things like trans identities and so on. So again, we need to be kind of sensitive to how we handle that. The organizations need to kind of think more sensitively about doing that in a way that's going to be a positive step forward rather than reactions against conflict. Um, so that's kind of putting it in context around how we situate ourselves within that wider ED&I kind of context. Oh, just a reminder, if you have any questions, just raise your hands or put a comment in the meeting chat. There'll be certain points where we'll stop and pause and have some reflective questions. So feel free to kind of if you want to talk or express yourselves, then do so at those points. And I think Claire's keeping an eye on the meeting chat for me, just so we can answer anything that comes through there as well. Um, so when we talk about kind of our identities and LGBT people, the academic literature somewhat kind of makes it a little bit more abstract. So in the literature, we talk about things called visible or invisible identities. So some identities or what's called stigmas, so things that might have a attachment to kind of shame or a marker of kind of societal kind of shame around that. Um, they call that some that are more invisible than others. So, for example, sexuality is more invisible because you have to get to know someone and they've got to reveal certain information about themselves for you to definitely know. Whereas more visible identities are kind of more obvious. There's more kind of visible signals around that. So, for example, someone's skin color might indicate an ethnicity or racial characteristic, or their kind of physical features might signal certain gender characteristics. And the literature talks about kind of invisible identities as being this kind of impression management dynamic where we're we're undergoing different situations at work where we might have to think about how we reveal ourselves in different contexts. So, for example, we might conceal certain information in certain situations or even fake an identity just to kind of get things out the way. So, for example, we might fake that our partner is an opposite sex partner, for example, just to get through a particular situation. Um, but those kind of concealing or faking dynamics is seen to be particularly detrimental to someone's kind of experience at work and their well-being. So generally, it's not considered a good idea. But there might be certain situations where it's actually sensible to do that when you're facing a lack of safety, for example. In contrast, the literature talks about kind of disclosure or openness, so being more open and honest about different parts of yourself in different interactions, can promote positive attitudes and well-being. So there's a general kind of gist there that being more open is more beneficial, but that I think is more nuanced in terms of the dynamics which have come out more recently. And that's kind of talking about the visibility conditions. So, for example, some things can become more visible. So, for example, um, there's some research talking about Black women, for example, that can become very hypervisible. So their gender and their ethnicity become much more sensitized to kind of criticism and evaluation. So again, it's not just this idea that being more open and disclosing and being kind of more authentic, if you like, about different identities, actually that can cause problems with this idea of being hyper visible and being hypersensitive to kind of evaluation from other people. So that's just to set it in with some of the academic literature. It's sometimes a bit abstract, but that's the kind of general idea where the LGBT kind of identity part sits within in the workplace. So we're just going to have a quick pause and reflect moment. So you don't have to share if you don't want to, but these are some kind of questions really just to think about. So how invisible or visible do you feel as an LGBT person at work? To what extent does that change or fluctuate over different work situations? And what affects your openness about yourself at work? So I've just seen there's some things in the
Is
chat.
anybody willing to come off mute and talk about this, or would we prefer to do it through the chat?
Um, I'm happy to talk about it.
Super, thank you.
Hi, Claire.
Hi.
I chair our firm's, well, I'm on the committee and I chaired my previous firm's LGBTQ plus network, so pretty visible. um, um, but the sort of second and third bullet points are quite opposite because the whole concept that we're all very familiar with in terms of having to come out in each new social work situation absolutely remains true. And I certainly don't go marching into a client meeting with a new client or indeed any sort of new work colleagues and sort of thrust that part of my identity forward. So one still has to approach those situations with caution. We actually ran an event at my firm, Shoesmiths, for National Coming Out Day, where we had a client come in, two senior people from client, myself and another senior person from my firm, talking about exactly these points. And what was really, really interesting is that two of the panel members were talking about how they were really quite keen very early on within conversations to signpost to flag their sexual identity to avoid any embarrassing moments or kind of even well intentioned but inadvertent kind of slip ups by new people that they were talking to. Myself and another person on the panel actually said, we didn't mind that and we quite enjoyed it when someone got it wrong, because we enjoyed pointing it out to them. And so it was quite an interesting, very small cross section of four relatively senior people within a work environment. And I think that by and large, I don't mind if people make an assumption. I know I probably should, but as I say, I do quite enjoy, because I'm cloaked in a lot of privilege and authority. I do quite enjoy pointing out, because invariably people feel really bad about it. But I would say that I still absolutely do when I'm meeting a new client, particularly men. I just see if I can pick up some signals from them as to their kind of openness to this sort of stuff. And you can sometimes get quite a good read on people, but I am a little bit cautious because you just don't want any awkward situations, really.
That came through strongly in our report as well, Michael, actually, that people were less likely to come out to clients and sort of externals. And I think it's exactly because of the reason you just described. It's just that social awkwardness of how well is this going to go down. We've had a comment from Will Morris. Luke, in a busy office, I can't come off mute, but I do feel that in my organisation, while I'm pretty visible, I do think it's hard for that visibility to be consistent as it is quite a heteronormative environment.
Yeah, thank you, Michael, and thanks, Will. Yeah, those things come up a lot in the research about this kind of that you're constantly kind of scanning what's called scanning the environment for cues about whether it's safe to reveal certain information or whether you feel there might be actually this kind of awkwardness, as you say, or you might perceive that how are they going to react to that information, and will it cause any kind of consequences, particularly if the organization might be a bit more risk averse, or might kind of say, well, you shouldn't have said that because that's too personal. Again, there's a lot of those kind of dynamics, particularly in roles where it's much more client facing, where you're having to do a lot more work with the public, or with more kind of with other stakeholders that have power.
Mm.
Yeah,
We've
and
had a
then
couple
yeah,
more comments there, Luke, saying similar things, but Bryony's brought up the idea of role modeling
mhm.
and trying to be more out, the idea of trying to be more out to be visible. Melanie said the same kind of thing. Melanie likes to make a conscious effort to model visibility with colleagues. That's something that I actually do as well. I just think if you're out in the world, you might be the only gay person that's ever come out to somebody, or the only person that they can sort of see as a frame of reference for what an LGBT person looks like. Heather said, I've had the opposite experiences. I now work full-time with the LGBT consortium, worked in the sector for a lot of years, so very out and visible, but in a former life many years ago, they worked in a sales job, and was fired from a job after their girlfriend met for a pint after work. And that was openly given as the reason. This is the kind of stuff we had coming through that report as well that I told you about. Matt's saying, I'd like to reframe the social awkwardness as belonging to the person that I come out to rather than me. But that can be harder when the awkwardness could create a business impact on my organization. So if you lose a gig because you've done that coming out thing.
Yeah, all really, really important stuff there. And it kind of highlights how complicated this is for people, and that these kind of decisions aren't, I think it quite often in the kind of coming out day rhetorics and that kind of thing, all you need to do is come out once and it's all fine and dandy. But actually, these kind of things are very complicated. There's lots of dynamics going on. So yeah, all these things are highly relevant, and it's just worth kind of reflecting on your own approach to this and what you feel comfortable with, because everybody does things differently, and what is the culture and climate in the organization and in the sector you are a part of, because that will shape what the parameters you are able to do that. So for example, being in an LGBT space and an organization that welcomes LGBT people, that's going to be a very different environment to a very traditional masculine dominated kind of industry, for example. So I'm just going to move on for time, but these are important things to kind of just reflect on personally. In the literature, so when we talk about disclosure or openness, around kind of the general idea that the more you're able to feel more open to other people and have that dynamic where you can feel more able to kind of have those conversations with people at work. The academic research doesn't say anything particularly groundbreaking. It's just like, yes, formal protections and policies sets a really good baseline. Having that is really good and sets a foundation for which everything else kind of comes from, but it's not the most important thing. Actually, it's more around the climate and the relationships and individual friendships people have at work. Because LGBT people are particularly sensitive to the perceived reactions. So thinking about um, the instead of actually doing it and then kind of seeing what happens, people are very much more sensitive around what if they react like this? What if I say something and then something bad happens as a consequence? So again, it's that kind of perception of what might happen rather than actually what does happen. That's particularly highlighted, I think, in terms of how people feel that support, because that support might be there, but actually it's that perception of it from the LGBT person. So again, not groundbreaking, but kind of says what we kind of expect, really, that having formal policies is good, but actually it's more about that subtle kind of dynamic in the organization. Um, when I came to this kind of research angle, I was a little bit disappointed, if you like, around the kind of obsession around disclosure and openness, around this kind of idea that everybody should be encouraged to come out at work, because it's not always the best kind of messaging sometimes, and actually it doesn't necessarily reflect the deeper level stuff going on for people. So I kind of gravitated towards the idea of authenticity and being authentic as something a little bit more meatier, a bit more psychologically meaningful to people. So authenticity loosely refers to kind of trying to act in ways that are congruent or aligned with your who you think you are as your true self. There's a whole debate about whether the true self actually exists, but I think most people have a general um, rule of thumb about what they consider to be their sense of true self, or I think people know when they're not being their true selves rather than what they think are their true self. So it's more about this idea that do I feel that I'm living and acting in ways that feel aligned to who I am as a person and my values. So there's one thing around authentic living, around that kind of, am I living the life that I want to lead? Am I living by my values at work? Do I feel like I can behave in ways that are aligned with those values? Self-alienation is more about the idea of um, when you come to work, you're putting on a front and you're kind of feeling completely estranged and disconnected to who you are outside of work. Some people do quite like the separation between work and non-work lives. They kind of actually have a preference to having a slightly different kind of identity at work. But this is about fundamentally feeling that deeper sense of disconnection and estrangement that actually when you come to work, you really feel completely kind of uh, in a sea, if you like, or an ocean. So it's about kind of having some kind of connection point to who you are outside of work. And external influence is about kind of trying not to be overly pressured to conform to the norms and standards of the workplace that might encroach too much on who you are as a person. So this is where perhaps there's a lot of heteronormative norms and values around how to dress, how to behave, how to express yourself, how to relate to other people, and it's kind of finding ways to manage that isn't kind of fundamentally disconnecting you from who you think you are or how you feel you are in general. So that's kind of where I was coming from. It was moving away from this idea that you should just come out and talk to other people about your identity to actually what does it mean to be kind of authentic and expressing that kind of LGBT identity in an authentic work a way that kind of connects with who you are. So this is just a pause and reflect moment again. Again, people might want to just kind of think about this. But what does authenticity mean to you at work, and how important or relevant is it? I think that varies from person to person. But kind of how important do you feel that is to you? What does it really look and feel like to you? One person's authenticity might differ from another's. And how do you know other people are being authentic? And is authenticity at work always a good thing?
Would anybody like to come off mute and discuss this? Bryony.
Yeah, thank you. Really enjoying this so far. Thanks, Luke. I just wanted to say that I think the authenticity thing is something I really struggled with in the past. I've also got ADHD, and one of the things in there is you do mask a hell of a lot and almost shapeshift in certain environments. So being in that safe space where I just let that go, once I've got that, I'm very reluctant to let it go. So I think, yeah,
Mhm.
having that safe space, especially with sort of lived experience networks and stuff where you can have a random conversation around mids and then what you had for tea. And then the fact that you're going on a date with a girl in 10 minutes, like there's no judgment there. And that is so heartwarming and valuable to me in a workplace.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think it's important that so you mentioned the kind of having those spaces and opportunities to kind of just let go and be authentic. And I think that's quite important to a lot of minoritized groups of people that actually doesn't matter so much to them to be authentic in all situations. It's about having those really specific opportunities to have that because that gives them that kind of space and time to do that.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think we've got Jay.
Jay.
Hi there, thanks, Luke. This is really interesting. I'm really fascinated by this notion of authenticity, and I've had lots of discussions about it because I sometimes think, well, when am I the most authentic? Is it when I'm work talking about my home life? Is it when I'm with my friends where you can have more banter and be a bit more unguarded? Is it when I'm talking with my mother who's been on Pride marches but now has Alzheimer's and now still asks me if I've got a girlfriend, and I decide not to go down that path? And in all of those moments, I'm very authentic to myself. And this notion of a fixed state that we're moving towards and moving away from, I struggle with. But I think you hit the nail on the head when you said, but we know when we're not being authentic. And I think it's contextual, situational. I think it's about, the environments we're in. So authentic self is a difficult notion in that we aspire to as a continuous thing. But knowing when we're not is something that we can really know. So yeah, just a reflection there, Luke. I'm not sure if it's warrants a reply, but just a thought.
Yeah, thank you. That's really important. There has been work done kind of looking at the way that authenticity does fluctuate, and it's very situationally and contextually embedded, as you say. Yeah, thank you.
Alexander's got their hand up.
Claire. I wanted to mention as well that there usually is potentially a price to pay for this as well. If you want to be authentic in the workplace, we have to remember people have their biases, people have their unconscious biases as well. So potentially we can be impacted negatively by this, by being passed for a promotion. So there is always this kind of courage as well, courage that it takes, or bravery that it takes to come out in the workplace and be authentically yourself.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's really important kind of notion of what personal competencies and skills and actually kind of having that courage, and that is kind of brought up later in the talk. Um, I'm just worried about time because I've got quite a bit to get through, but does anyone have any really specific?
We've got a quick point from Ruth, if that's okay, Ruth.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I'm lucky now where I work. I can completely be my authentic self. I'm in middle management, so I can support by coming out myself. I left the place just as the Equality Act came in, came out as gay and got bullied out. So when I joined my new job, I got married to my wife 3 days before. Well, I got civil partnership 3 days before I joined my new job. So at that point, I was very determined. I am joining as me, and no one's going to take that away from me.
Mm.
I came from an all-girls school where, because of Section 28, nothing apart from heterosexual relationships were taught. So for me, being able to come and be in an organisation where I am now, where I can be who I am, I can support. I've got somebody on my team who is lesbian. She's just gone through IUI. They've got a beautiful baby girl. So I can support my team going through that sort of thing. So for me, it's the most important thing that I can do that. So authenticity to me means me being me being able to say, I'm Ruth, I'm a queer female. I can't use the word lesbian because for me, when I was growing up, that was the biggest insult ever. So I'm a queer or a gay woman. And I get what everybody else said about the risks. I got bullied out of my old job because of it. So it's knowing your psychological safety and knowing who you can talk to. But
Yeah,
thank
thank
you.
you.
And it's a fantastic, fantastic talk today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for sharing that story. Yeah, it's horrible when you hear these kind of experiences happen or happened and still are happening to people. But yeah, I think this comes up later around the kind of leadership angle, which is people feeling that real sense of responsibility, LGBT people in management positions, to kind of be a more visible role model and kind of help other people navigate this space as well. I'm just going to move on for time reasons because I know it's kind of over halfway. So I'm not going to kind of dwell on this too much, but there's some research examples where I've done some work kind of trying to link how LGBT people feel about their organization's policies and practices and whether or not that connects with their kind of life satisfaction and feeling kind of good as a person. And we found that being those supportive policies and practices are really important for both being more open at work as well as feeling more authentic. But it's that authenticity piece which seems to be a little bit more powerful at kind of connecting kind of whether you're in a good environment to actually whether you actually feel that broader sense of life satisfaction. So that gave me a bit more hope that actually authenticity seems to be a little bit more of a kind of powerful explanation than just kind of disclosure or being open to people. Now we're going to move on to talking about kind of authentic leadership, and Ruth's kind of point there really kind of resonates with this part of the talk, which is kind of the idea that it's authenticity coupled with a kind of moral and ethical principle that can help you as a leader. And we use the term leader lightly. It's kind of more around it doesn't reflect being in a senior leadership position necessarily. It reflects whether you are in any kind of position where you are kind of motivating others and so on. So this is formed a kind of adaptive authenticity. You have to adapt your authenticity to your role as a leader, because every role that we do, particularly in leadership, there's certain expectations and certain demands on us. So we can't be truly authentic. In a sense, we have to adapt that authenticity to what that role expects us to deliver. So this is about kind of 4 different dimensions which have been developed by a load of researchers in America over kind of 20 years ago, I think, where they talk about there's authentic leadership is around self-awareness, so really being aware of your own strengths and weaknesses, and also reflecting on other people's and how you impact others. Being transparent, so this is more about openly sharing information and sharing yourself, your true self to others, and having those genuine conversations about and being open and honest a bit more about not just yourself, but about the expectations about leadership and the demands on people around that. Balanced processing, which is more about kind of trying to take a step back, trying to be more analytical, making decisions, and trying to bring in lots of voices and kind of balancing those different voices when you're making decisions. And I think this is where some people have an issue with the idea of internal morals, but the authentic leadership kind of group of researchers kind of really think this is quite important to differentiate authentic leadership from just being authentic. So, for example, if you think about Trump versus other people could say that Trump is an authentic leader. Authentic leadership scholars might say, well, actually, is he guided by internal morals here? What's his internal morals? So again, it's kind of reflecting that it should be grounded from a kind of ethical positioning rather than just being true to yourself in every situation as a leader. I know there's lots of messages coming in, but Claire, can you just kind of keep an eye if there's
Yes,
anything?
I'm keeping an eye. It's a nice
Yeah.
conversation that's happening.
Okay, great.
So, but I think, yeah, for the sake of you getting through your slides, you should carry on.
Yeah, there'll be a moment to kind of reflect on things and discuss. So I've done a couple of projects looking at what it means to be an LGBT person in an authentic leader. So project 1 was a kind of survey-based research project where we were looking at the question is enacting authentic leadership more important to LGBT managers' engagement and satisfaction with their work? So does it lead to anything beneficial for the LGBT manager or not, compared to if you're not an LGBT manager? So we did a load of surveys with around 200 LGBT managers and around 200 heterosexual cisgender managers. And we asked them to rate their leadership behaviors on lots of different scales. So we looked at kind of the more traditional transformational kind of dynamics around leadership to kind of more authentic elements around leadership. And then we assessed how engaged they were with their kind of managerial role and managerial work, and whether or not they felt kind of satisfied with their careers. And we found, I'll come on to the findings in a minute, but essentially we found that it was a little bit more important for LGBT managers. It had a deeper connection with their sense of engagement and career satisfaction. And then project 2 is about, we asked a deeper question about how do LGBTQ plus leaders experience authentic leadership in relation to their managerial or leadership role. So these were interviews with just over 20 LGBT people in various managerial and leadership roles. And we just asked questions around their career history, their leadership development, their kind of how they think about leadership in their role, how they think about their LGBT identity at work, and how they connect that kind of idea of authenticity with their leadership and managerial kind of work. And that has more nuances, which I'll explain in a minute. I'll skip over this one briefly. This one just basically says for project one for the surveys that that authentic leadership seems to be specifically important to LGBT managers' sense of being engaged at work, so feeling enthusiastic and connected to their work that they're doing, and also to their satisfaction. And it seems to be really specifically connected to LGBT managers who have low self-confidence. So it seems to be much more powerful at explaining or helping at least people with perhaps lacking self-confidence in leadership ability to really kind of feel more engaged and feel that deeper sense of career satisfaction. It wasn't really relevant as much for non-LGBTQ plus managers. So it seemed to be that actually it was much this idea of authentic leadership really resonated more so with LGBT managers. So project 2 is about kind of the interviews that we did, and this was much more nuanced. So this was thinking about how LGBT managers really navigating this tension between being authentic at work and being a leader and having to do leadership stuff. And we found that essentially there was these tension points between things that really verified and affirmed their sense of identity as both an LGBT person and as an effective leader. But there was other things that kind of pulled them away into kind of feeling quite stressed and anxious and having to put themselves into difficult positions around navigating, for example, organizational politics, having to kind of struggle against acceptance of who they were, both outside and inside work, how they felt there were certain kind of discriminatory dynamics or things happening which I felt really uncomfortable about at work around this kind of idea of existential labor, kind of feeling that they had to kind of battle through some really problematic stuff at work. But on the other hand, there was these ideas of kind of really figuring out who you are, really feeling grounded in who you are. I think Ruth kind of touches on that, kind of suddenly being really kind of not going back, kind of always going forward and really thinking, this is who I am and I'm not going to compromise on that. And then kind of really feeling that responsibility and wanting to make a difference to other people. So there was this kind of dynamic between, on one hand, developing yourself and developing other people, and then the other connection point was things that verified and affirmed who you are versus things that kind of put you in difficult positions and made you quite stressed and anxious. And that all was kind of connected to kind of your personal circumstances and the organizational context. So I hope that kind of makes sense. I'll go through it in a little bit more detail. So these were some of the challenges that came up. So some were talking about inner struggles, so the deeply personal journeys LGBT leaders navigated in their life and how they calibrated that authenticity throughout those journeys of accepting who they are. So Juan talks about he felt really difficult, finding it really difficult to kind of accept who he was as a gay man. And then he kind of reached a point where actually he felt strong enough personally to be able to take that risk he talks about. So that's kind of really important to his journey and having to go through that inner struggle. Fitting in and navigating politics. This is about kind of managing that LGBT identity and authenticity in ways that are accepted by other people in the organization, because what we might feel as authentic, other people might perceive as other things. So Robin talks about being in middle management and being in that heteronormative environment and really struggling with trying to kind of have to navigate and fit into that kind of masculine kind of managerial kind of dynamic when it kind of felt unnatural to his authenticity. And then emotional and existential labor is more about having to cope and comply to organizational demands or client dynamics. So this one's about Julie's experience of where a client was making a homophobic joke and not really knowing what to do, and then they decided to kind of confront that situation in that moment. But it was kind of this idea of, what do I do? I feel conflicted. What do I do in those situations? So the kind of question here is really, how do any of those examples resonate with you, and are there any other kind of challenges that you've faced or experienced?
It's quite a tricky question, perhaps, for people. Does anybody
It
feel
is, yeah.
comfortable talking about anything like this? Remember that this is being recorded as well,
Yeah.
and will be publicly available afterwards. So if you don't want to speak about it, then I'm sure, Luke, you have
Yeah,
some
I can
more
move.
examples.
Yeah, I can move on. Yeah. So these are kind of things to reflect on in terms of your own journeys, but these are things that came up in the interviews. Opportunities. So these are things that kind of, as you say, kind of help with their sense of identity and expression of that identity in the leadership and role, and feeling kind of able to really make a difference. So Charlie, for example, talks about this, really understanding this sense of becoming authentic and really knowing who you are, and feeling that personal safety and being grounded in that sense of who you are. And I think Ruth kind of reflected on that as well, but kind of, becoming into yourself. And then owning one's identity is then becoming a source of that identity being a source of confidence, leading authentically, and kind of understanding how you translate that sense of leadership into actual behaviors. So this is Chris's story about gaining confidence as a trans woman, telling her story, and people respecting her for that, and that kind of then leading on to how she changed her kind of leadership style, to kind of really feel that sense of authenticity and kind of confidence in leading through empowerment. Being visible and making a difference. This is this inner sense of responsibility to channel that authenticity into facilitating inclusion. So really kind of thinking through ways in which to promote inclusion in the workplace, think about how to help other LGBT colleagues. That really came through a lot in those interviews. And also strategically, so some people were quite strategic. They were able to see how they could leverage their position as a middle manager or as a lead of a staff network, for example, to really lean into that authenticity piece to gain resources and support from senior leaders, for example. So getting money or getting buy-in to do more stuff in the organization. So again, just a reflection point. Do any of those kind of opportunities resonate with you? Are there any other opportunities that might be relevant? For time, I'll just move on. There'll be lots of comments, I'm sure, in the meeting chat. But I think fundamentally is there's this dynamic where we're pushed and pulled in different directions. So there's this underlying tension when you're trying to navigate authenticity, particularly as a leader or a manager, that you're trying to do lots of different things, and some things are going to push you in directions that are going to be quite stressful, and other situations that are actually going to feel very rewarding and satisfying. The other thing that we can't ignore, and this research kind of is acontextual, it doesn't really talk about the social political stuff going on, but I think we can't ignore that those tension points are really exacerbated at the moment with a lot of these social political things globally around ED&I and LGBT rights, amongst other things. So the question really is, how do we move forward authentically as individuals and as kind of LGBT professionals, but also in a responsible way, so that we can take those risks, but not, and know how to navigate those tensions without it kind of placing too much burden on us, and also isn't going to cause more and more backlash against LGBT people. I don't have an answer for this, but one way forward is to connect the idea of authenticity with inclusive leadership. And this is something that's being debated a bit in the academic literature about, are there connection points between the two, and how should leaders kind of take forward this kind of idea of inclusive leadership, but also remain authentic to who they are. So this is some combinations of inclusive leadership that's been talked about, things like supporting all members of your team to feel that they belong and are respected. And these are also people that you might disagree with, or people that might come with different views about things as well. So it's about trying to support everybody to feel that they belong and are respected for their views. Supporting all members to be actively engaged and positively contribute. Ensuring justice and equity are upheld, and supporting those who are minoritized or at least are least represented to have opportunities to be heard and listened to. So I suppose I've got a few more slides, but I think I'm gonna end it possibly just with an open conversation at this point about what is the connection point between authenticity and inclusion in terms of leadership. What's the most important aspects to consider?
Who would like to discuss this with us? Does anybody have views? Thanks to everybody who's put stuff in the chat as well about your stories and your experiences. It's really great to have a community like this to share these kinds of things. Jay, you've
Yeah, I'm just
raised your
looking at
hand.
these.
Thank you. Please bear with me, Luke Claire. I'm someone who speaks to think rather than thinks to speak. So things come out and I get there in a meandering way eventually. And I think that you're really hitting on the tension between authenticity, but being in a leadership role where sometimes you are responsible for leading others, and how do you create that culture of inclusivity? But there lies a challenge, and a really significant challenge. So, for example, we're having lots of conversations at the moment around freedom of speech in academia and how that can be managed alongside people with protected philosophical beliefs, for example, where identity and existence is pitched around, alongside people's beliefs about who or shouldn't be allowed rights, access to society, and the benefits it affords. And as someone within that environment, we're constantly in a situation where we have to think about protecting others, and now potentially being sued, if we don't afford spaces for others to air views and debate things. And you talked about emotional and existential labor. And that really is felt by a lot of people at the moment, where there's a tension where you've got to be in spaces and sometimes facilitate spaces that every fiber of my being anyway resists against, wants to react against, where you have people higher up the management chain who want to be overly cautious, which can really impact groups and communities who are marginalized, and people with very strong, unpleasant voices are centered. And it's really hard not to be labeled the angry queer person all the time. So you try to step away from that. I think this is really helpful to think about authenticity. It's really helpful to think of leadership. It's also extremely challenging as well. And I suppose, well, Luke, I suppose with your research, with the wider contextual factors, how is that coming across in findings, and how is that shaping your findings?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important point. I think it's something that we've reflected on in terms of research teams, and a lot of people are reflecting on that in kind of other kind of more discussion-based kind of research about kind of where should we be positioning this? What is should we go towards? I'm trying to understand why the backlash is happening, and these kind of things, or should we go against it? It's a really difficult dynamic to tread, and I think some people are going to be more willing to kind of try and do compromise than other people, and it's about trying to figure out that kind of, at the end of the day, when people say to me, "Oh, what's your stance on trans inclusion?" I just say, "Well, my stance is about inclusion." So it's not, so you might disagree on certain things around trans rights or gender rights, but it's about fundamentally everybody, lots of people are existing. So we can't ignore that you know, gender critical people exist and don't exist. They do exist, and we can't ignore that trans people exist because they do exist. So it's trying to find a way forward that is inclusive of and make sure that the rights of trans people are protected. But at the same time, we can't ignore the fact that gender critical people do have a very strong view on this, and they want to be respected as well. So I don't have an answer for it. It's kind of something that I've been trying to struggle with myself, about where do I draw the line. And I always say it's about inclusion, not exclusion of trans people. So we need to be focusing on how do we best move forward with protecting trans people's rights and including them, rather than doing blanket bans, for example. How is that upholding the principle of inclusion? So I always just go back to what should inclusion look like, rather than
Thank you, Luke. Luke, we've got
yeah.
like a minute left, and we've
Yeah,
got
so
two people's hands up. So we've got Matt and Jay. If I'm going to take what Matt says and then go straight to Jay, and then hopefully we'll have time for reflection. And if not, we might just go over by a couple of minutes. So I appreciate if some people have to drop away. Matt.
Yeah, hopefully just a quick point, but I was really interested and struck by what you said right at the start around sort of moving away from perhaps thinking about things like unconscious bias towards taking an intersubjective view. And I thought, is that something that could help kind of lower the temperature that's being very willfully increased by bad actors involved in these debates? Or, but another part of me thinks, well, actually, do we just sort of, if we soften, do we cede some ground actually in what has become, quite a divisive, polarized kind of fight, really, for increasingly who is right about what is real or what's not real. It feels like it's got to that depth. So I just wonder if you had any reflections on that at all, because I think it was a really interesting idea.
Jay, we'll just take your question as well.
Yeah. So
and then Luke, you
Well,
can pick them
thank
both up
you.
at the same time.
Yeah, I'll just be very quick here, and it's just going back to the earlier point. And Luke, this isn't really for you to answer, it's just a wider reflection where now, in terms of gender identity, people seem to think we should be respecting gender conservative voices because it's not critical theory, they're not critical of anything about gender, it's just conservative views of gender. We don't, when we're thinking about EDI policy around race and ethnicity, invite white supremacists to come and share their views, which is also now arguably a protected philosophical belief with how things are going. We don't do that. So all of a sudden we're creating a space where people's identities can be disseminated and their rights being completely eradicated from daily life. So it's not something that there's an answer to. It's, as you say, it's a very strange space right now. But there's a real inequity how we're talking about trans and queer identities compared to other identities. When we're looking at the policies around menopause, when we're looking at policies around women's rights, we don't invite men's rights groups who are these like incels to come and have a view about this. It's really, there's so much disparity here, and it's just hard to swallow. And I suppose that's the if Claire remembered me for mentioning training before, I get a bit emotional sometimes. Thank you.
Yeah, I completely get that. It's how I feel as well. It's noticeable how certain pieces of work around minoritized groups, certain people get invited and some people don't, and that changes depending on what the topic is. I think fundamentally we need to think about whose voices are not being heard in these spaces. How do we best represent those voices without putting them under too much pressure? And I think it's also we shouldn't be I think we need to be raising the issue that some people are going down the direction of very hardline views and opinions and attitudes, which are offensive and problematic for all sorts of reasons. But also, I think we need to create spaces for people that don't really fully understand certain things, or feel uncomfortable about where where some of the minority rights are going, but they're kind of in that middle ground. I think they're the ones that we need to convince and to persuade and to encourage to engage with these conversations, rather than being kind of persuaded in one particular direction. And I think from Matt's point, this subjectivity part is important. I think people are getting really fed up with being told that they're prejudiced and they're racists and all that kind of stuff. And I think the language of bias and you're biased and you're the problem, I don't think is helping. And I think we need to try and kind of help people kind of shift a little bit and not feel threatened by this. That actually, I think we've let go of this live and let live situation, which was very much part of British values, and I think we've lost that kind of live and let live kind of perspective, that we might not always agree on certain things, but fundamentally we should be respecting those that have the least rights and are the most vulnerable in society. But that's my
What a way
Yeah.
to finish. What a way to wrap us up. Thank you so much, Luke. I know that people are dropping away, so I'll just quickly remind you, check out our events. We've got loads over the next few months already booked in. We've got an in-person one as well next month. The annual conference is on the 5th of November. Put it in your diaries so you don't miss it. Have a look at our report. Have a look at that training that we've got available as well. It's limited to 20 participants, so get your name in early. And there'll be a recording of this put online. I'll ask Luke if we can share these slides with the group as well, because somebody's asked for that. So if we can, I'll send those around to you. I want to thank charity people who put this all on for us and help us manage everything to do with our online events. And lastly, obviously, Luke, I'd like to thank you for being wonderful, being a brilliant speaker and talking to us about these all of this stuff. I know from the engagement that people have loved it. So thank you so much. Have a great day, everybody.